For everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard.
When I hear the word sin, my mind doesn't go to specific things we do. It's the condition we live in. It's the condition that we live our lives in. We live in sin. It's not stuff we do, it's the way we live.
But don't we identify that a lot? That is a sin, the Ten Commandments. And is sinning in thought the same thing as sinning in deed?
It's, we're all looking for the loophole. And it just goes to me, my mind goes right to what is grace? There's just, grace is so radical and so countercultural, so counterintuitive, that even though we, as Lutherans, we talk about grace, we believe in grace, that God's grace is free, because nothing else in the world works that way. We're looking for, what's the recipe for success? What do I got to do or not do? Well, I shouldn't dance, I should do this, I can't do this, maybe I can think this, but I can't talk about that. Or, we're still looking for the ladder that we need to climb in order to say, God, I may not be perfect, but I'm okay, I'm pretty good, or good enough. And it's just not how it works. So, are there certain sinful behaviors that I could name? Yeah, of course I can, but I'm not gonna, lying and being hurtful to other people and to being selfish. Those to me are behaviors that make us to be less than our best selves, that don't help us in that response to God's love to try to be more and more like Jesus. So yeah, there are things that I would name as sin, but that's not where my mind goes, is to stuff. It's a condition.
If we're saved through Jesus, aren't we saved from our sins?
We are at once saint and sinner, because through God's grace, through God claiming me in my baptism and saying, I love you just the way you are. And when I look at you now, I'm not looking at you through these glasses. I'm looking them through Christ-colored lenses. So when I look at you now, no worries. I see Christ. I see someone that Christ died for. So in baptism, I hear that promise that I'm going to love you forever. Martin Luther said, every morning you wake up, make the sign of the cross on your forehead, and you remember, I am baptized. So in a very real sense, every day is the first day of the rest of your life, that I am cleansed, I am renewed, because when God looks at me, I'm going to remember that God puts on those Christ-colored glasses. So yeah, I still sin, but yeah, I'm still saved. So we are at once saint and sinner.
Is God involved in our suffering? And if so, to what extent?
Yes, I believe God is involved in all of life. And so God is involved in our suffering every bit as much as God is involved in our joys, our sorrows, our fears, our hopes, our dreams. God is a part of our suffering. If you're asking me, does God cause suffering?
Why does he allow
God willfully cause us to suffer? I'm not going to go that far. To deal with God's role in suffering is that age-old theodicy question. If God is all good and God is all powerful, why is there evil in the world? Those are three statements that, from our manner of thinking, cannot be held in any kind of creative tension. That something's awry. If God is all good and God is all-knowing, then logic would tell us there would never be suffering. And yet there is. If God's intention in Jesus is for us to have that full identification, then suffering is going to be a part of that experience. It's part of the human experience. In suffering, we can sometimes have the most intense and powerfully present moments with God. And I can say that because I hear that when I talk to people, when I am present with people in hospitals, at points of death, at points of suffering, either personal suffering or suffering on behalf of a loved one, that it is at those points of suffering when someone realizes there is nothing I can do to remedy this situation. The only thing I can do is cling to God. And that is that moment where you do experience the peace of God passing all understanding, where you do hear in the depths of your heart, all will be well, all will be well. And you cling to that hope and that possibility that amidst all of this that seems so much not of God, that God is there. And that God is pulling me into a preferred future. The very question itself is one of those where we have switched places with God and we have put ourselves in the center of the universe and said, why would God do that to me? And so we're putting God on trial there and saying, somehow I ought to be able to understand the mind of God and integrate that into my experience. I ought to be able to do that.
Oh, no, but go ahead.
And it's just the wrong starting point. We're not the center of the story. God is the center of the story. So I can't answer the question, but I think the premise of it, if I put my faith hat on, the premise of it is off base. It's assuming that God needs to answer my little questions. We know and see and experience here will come to an end. Sin is a part of that. Suffering is a part of that. We're all going to grow old. This body I have is continually changing. It's not going to last forever. And if I equate sinfulness with finitude, with life, that this is all there is. Sin and suffering are a part of this worldly experience. I mean, it's called theology of the cross for us, again, as Lutherans, that the place that we really meet Jesus is in our suffering. Because as long as we have as long as things are clicking along reasonably okay, we are under this illusion that we can somehow control things, that we can somehow manage things, that we can somehow chart a course. And so when things are going well, it's so easy to think, I don't need God. And yet it's in our suffering, and Jesus is identifying with that suffering, that's where we meet Christ. And Christ says, yeah, this world involves sin and suffering, but I have an answer. This system, I have broken this system. And it's not because of what you did, it's because of what I did. So we meet Jesus in that point of suffering, and we hear, but it doesn't have the last word. So God is powerfully present in that suffering.